everyone. Thank you very much for joining us. Welcome to the 2021 Poverty Solutions Summit. This is the Rethinking Narratives panel. We're very excited to have you joining us, where we are looking at ways to retire exploitative approaches and empower storytellers. So we're very excited to have all of you and excited to have our presenters as well. My name is Melissa Taveras. I'm the Media and Government Relations Director at the Florida Immigrant Coalition. I have been working in the immigration advocacy space for more than 5 years. Prior to that, I worked as a journalist. I'm also the proud daughter of immigrant parents who migrated from the Dominican Republic more than 20 years ago. So I'm very excited to be joining space with all of you and to be introducing my co-panelists. First, we have Juan Escalante, who fled Venezuela in 2000 with his two brothers for the United States following the election of Hugo Chavez. In 2006, an immigration attorney mishandled Mr. Escalante's case, which led him to lose his immigration status despite waiting in line while paying taxes and immigration fees. By the time President Obama announced the Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals program, DACA, in 2012, Juan had graduated from Florida State University with a political science degree and had helped spearhead some of the digital tactics used across immigration-related campaigns throughout the country. Thanks to DACA, Juan was able to return to FSU and obtained a master's degree in public administration in 2015. He has remained a fierce and relentless advocate for immigrant rights, and he is a renowned and nationally recognized digital strategist. Juan currently enjoys the protections of DACA while leading state and national efforts to pass sensible immigration legislation.
All right, Kacey, why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself? I think that we cut off right at the height of your introduction, so I want to make sure that we give a rather proper welcome to you as joining me as a co-panelist here.
Sure, thanks so much. So I run a small communications firm that does social issue advocacy. We work with nonprofits and foundations and mission-driven companies to drive social and political change forward. I am a strategy expert that has, over 18 years of experience where I've moved from a high school classroom, being a teacher in a high school classroom, to leading national campaigns that really drive these intractable social and political issues. I've worked with clients most recently to engage Black women around their sexual health, build new narratives around Latino representation and inclusion in our democracy and policymaking, and tell compelling stories that really help us to redefine what public safety looks like in our country. Some of my clients include the California Wellness Foundation, the UCLA Latino Policy and Politics Initiative, as well as Community Coalition, which is a small community-based organization here in Los Angeles, where I live, and the Ella Baker Center for Human Rights. To all my work, I'm really focused on bringing a lens of justice and equity, and always creating space to amplify the voices of those who go unheard. Juan, I can't hear you.
Mercury is definitely in retrograde. I understand that out of the two of us, you're actually the one that is located currently in Florida.
No, I'm in Los Angeles.
In that case, I'll rectify in that case. As folks know, we're speaking to an audience down in Catalyst, in Miami and other parts of the country. So we're really thankful for you to be joining despite the technical difficulties that we're suffering or experiencing rather throughout this broadcast. I wanted to just, for the sake of time, dive into the immediacy of the questions in here. As Kacey and I disclosed, we both work for a variety of different issues mine being specifically centered around narratives on immigration, and specifically on migrants, refugees, TPS holders, something that the audience that was watching this program right out of Miami may be familiar with given the recent election. So Kacey, let's just dive down into the meat of this panel. I think Tech is just sending me a message in terms of trying to figure out whether or not we'll get Melissa back. But in the meantime, how can we create strength-based storytelling, rather than focusing on our clients' challenges, which are larger societal problems most of the time. And I think you and I, during the prep of this conversation, rather focused, I must say, on essentially some of the techniques that big corporations or big brands use to essentially profit, or rather misalign some of the story narratives that we may see from the work that you and I may do on the field, rather.
Mm-hmm. So first of all, thank you, Juan, for jumping in so effectively as a host for this conversation. So to your question that you asked, one of the things that I always try to do is think about how people think about themselves. Would they say that, the way that they're often presented in media narratives is only by their challenges, right? Because that is what drives media. But if you actually talk to those people, is the first thing that they would talk to you about the challenges they have, or would it be about the things that they find joy in? And the other place that I like to start from, which is how me and my business partner, who is another woman of color, approach all our work, is from a framework of freedom and liberation. And if you think of people being free, you automatically have to think that they have strengths that they are going to be able to contribute to the world. If you think of people as wanting to be able to liberate everyone, right? And be in that movement and be in that work, you have to believe that people have agency and strengths of their own to live life. And that everyone has something to contribute. So I'm really always coming at issues from how would people first describe themselves and approach this problem before I think about how I would do it, because I might not have the same challenges that they have. I might not have the same strengths that they have. So it's always from an asset-based framework for me. And, a good example is the work we did around Black women's sexual health. There's let's say, I'm going to be real clear here. I think that Black women run the world, right? We're creative and we do this under so much oppression, right? We create, and not only are we creating space for us, but we create space for others in the process. And what we did with that campaign was, yes, there's a challenge of Black women being more likely to get HIV and STIs, but they also believe in themselves. So how can we validate that belief in themselves? How can we validate the strengths that they hold within themselves, that we are, we are loud, we can be demanding? How are those strengths rather than the deficits that people normally frame them as, right? How can we realign those personality traits with something really positive to create a positive campaign that engages Black women using their own culture and their own voice to say, yeah, actually, this is a challenge that I have a solution to, and I can really attack that problem and get to the solution, because this person didn't just say, here's the problem, here's the solution, go do it, but they actually tried to meet me where I was and use my strengths to get me there. And so that's just a little bit about how I think our firm in the way that I think about things is different than a lot of communicators who are out there thinking through essentially how do we drive media narratives, and we always should be starting from strength rather than deficit.
You know, in kind of hearing your response to that question, I kind of reflect back on some of the learnings that not just I've made personally, but rather the immigrant rights movement is currently making at the time. But during the introduction that Melissa gave, for those of you who were able to hear it, and for those who weren't, I'll kind of just go over it again. I started this journey on advocacy back in 2006 at a time where I was still in my teens and kind of fresh out of high school, not really sure what I wanted to do with my life, but I knew that I wanted to go to college. And at the time, there was this narrative that was woven within the press and the mainstream media about essentially the good versus bad immigrant. The good immigrant was, you know, to kind of, you know, be vulnerable, was someone like me who had a 4.0 GPA, had perfect grades, had never gotten in trouble with the law, that, you know, for those in Miami, you know, he's a pobrecito who just wants to go to school. He wants a shot at the American dream. And, you know, I wrote that narrative into college and essentially spearheading a lot of the essentially very, unfortunately, very dangerous pitfalls of the narrative that we're trying to combat now, given the fact that we know that immigration is not just about dreamers, that immigration is not just about the perfect model, role model immigrant, and we're trying to ample or rather broaden a lot of those a lot of that narrative, so that we're able to make sure that the stories and the challenges of people who may not look like me, rather who may not be Latinos, but rather, you know, are Black immigrants, TPS holders, people from other parts of the world, and we see that reflected in today's narrative. As we're speaking right now, we're actually in the preparation for this panel, we took broad considerations about some of the narratives that were back then, just like the one that I spoke about, and some of the narratives that we're talking about right now. And in the past 48, 72 hours, we've seen a dialogue emerge online in terms of the treatment and erasure of Black immigrants, as we continue to say and work with the Biden administration to prevent a lot of the work that is being laid out in terms of undoing the cruel policies of the previous administration. But simultaneously to that, there are what is being labeled as these ICE flights, or these deportation flights to parts of Africa, to Haiti and beyond. And while some of that is actually being rolled back to some scale, and we've seen immediate action by the Biden administration to stop some of those flights, we can continue to see that the work in the way that immigration continues to be played out in a larger narrative needs to have a focus specifically on the Black immigrant experience and how it differs from the traditional, you know, Mexican American experience, South Florida experience, because the truth of the matter is that when we talk about immigration being not essentially a linear experience, we mean it. We mean that it's a patchwork, and we need to make sure that we're grounded in our individual communities, but also learning from others and how they're essentially not just surviving the shock and trauma that this broken immigration system may bring upon them, but at the same time, make sure that their stories are incorporated in and highlighted throughout the arc of any sort of advocacy effort that we may be pushing forward. So I wanted to just kind of pause in there and just kind of reflect back before I give it back over to Kacey here, because obviously I just kind of rushed through a variety of different points, you know, from my personal experience to current politics, but and I'll get to this myself in a little bit, but Kacey, can you tell us a little bit about the way that you, you know, essentially talk to your clients or talk to communities about, you know, the way to actually incorporate storytelling techniques into effective, you know, campaigns or effective tactics out there? Because I think that oftentimes, you know, it's incumbent not just on, you know, movement leaders or strategists to essentially help broaden the scope in here, but also it's imperative for people to kind of take away something about the next time that they're trying to come up with the next big idea, the next big campaign, and are searching for that new angle to make sure that they're inclusive and representative enough.
Yeah. So, Juan, I just want to appreciate you bringing forward that point about the different stories that there are to tell, even within the immigration space, right? And I think that sometimes we oversimplify storytelling. And what I really love about storytelling, like, I love the nuance of a story. Like, I don't buy a book, right, just to get the plot. I buy a book to get the plot and all the details that bring it to life. And so I think this is very clear in the immigration space, when you can have like the bad immigrant versus the good immigrant narrative. It's an example of oversimplifying that we do. And that doesn't allow us to bring forward the nuance. It also doesn't allow us to tell the myriad stories that there are to tell across an issue spaces spectrum. And so I really just appreciate, I want more communicators to start thinking, how do I tell these really nuanced stories in a way that are maybe packaged in these bite-sized pieces, so that I can get the full story and not just a simple plot summary, right? Because these stories are really rich. The lives of just everyday people, even though they may be experiencing challenges, are really rich and they're really interesting. And if you are somebody who wants to know those stories, they're really compelling, not just from a perspective of how can we actually address these challenges, but I also think we have to start thinking about, how does knowing these stories enrich my life? Because if we don't make it personal for people, then they just won't care. But the reality is, addressing these things and telling different people's stories actually enriches our own lives. And we really need to start I think we need to start driving that narrative as well, that there's self-interest here, as well as benefit to the person this messaging or these programs serve. But to get back to your original question,
we have time, so no worries.
Okay. I think the really best way to share a story is to think about what really drives us. And at the end of the day, it's not logic, right? So I can give you a ton of facts and figures, and I say this to the folks that I work with all the time, including organizers on the ground that I work with, who know this intimately. But the things that drive us, the things that make us make decisions about issues, or even just things in our everyday lives, like whether to purchase something, for example, it's not based on how much money we have in our pockets. It's not based on facts and figures around those. It's about how it makes us feel. Does this make me feel good? Does it make me feel angry? Does it make me feel bad? And I mean, this is what drives our social media conversations, mostly anger in that context. But it's really what drives us to make a decision about an issue and to act in a certain way on that issue. So I always tell folks that I work with that we're driving for feeling first, but we also have to always remember that it needs to be grounded in fact, not the other way around. It's not, it's feeling. You're on mute again, so I can't hear the wonderful thing you're saying.
I feel like when you're talking about social media, and essentially, I like this point mainly because I feel that some of the things that you're elaborating on, we just experience as a collective here, in terms of misinformation, disinformation, the delegitimizing of our institutions, election results, which also kind of comes back to the point that you're making about stories and the way that we, and by we, I rather mean social media platforms and people behind those computers, try to delegitimize individuals, or in some cases, go even further about dehumanizing them.
Yes, I mean, and the best way to fight dehumanization is to always humanize, right, on the other side. And a human story is really always more compelling, at least from my perspective, not from everyone's perspective, right? But the people that you want to bring in to the whole, a human story is always going to be more compelling than the non-humanizing. And, you know, I always really advise people to think about aspiration, right? It's not like we could talk about the problems all day long, but I would much rather talk about the aspiration. And that doesn't mean that you don't acknowledge the challenges, right? Because that's inauthentic. If you talk to somebody who you really want to create space for, and just to be clear, I view my job as creating space for others. When I say that I'm a storyteller, it doesn't mean that I am co-opting people's stories. It means that I am creating space and giving people, and hopefully giving people the tools that they need to tell their own stories in an authentic way, and to use their own voice that's never gone anywhere. It's not been lost. It's not been non-existent. It's people speaking into a void, right? And so I want to create a space that is not a void, but a space where those voices that have been talking for a really long time amongst themselves can be heard by the broader public. And so like, that is really how I approach all of my work, is that the power is in communities. There are voices in communities, and we just haven't been listening. So how do we create space? How do I have power and privilege in my own ways. I have lack of privilege in many ways, but I always acknowledge I am a college educated person. I am, cisgender. From a socioeconomic perspective, I'm very privileged. So how am I also, I'm always thinking about how do I use those spaces where I do have power and privilege to disrupt power and privilege, and in particular, white supremacy and patriarchy. Those are my goals, and it's not through just using my own voice, but it's through creating space for other marginalized people to use theirs.
Thank you for that. I think there's some comments in here. If we go to the chat, telling stories is extremely important. The media is responsible for telling many of them. How can we hold the media more accountable for downplaying language for specific groups of people? There's another comment also from Alyssa. Should the man, quote unquote. So I think, to kind of get back to some of the points that you're making here, Kacey, just to kind of tie it back, and I'm looking at the clock here in the corner of my screen to make sure that we allowed ourselves some Q&A time for our audience. Goes back to, and I made some notes in here about making it personal. You talked about that at the top of, of the answer to that question, but also it reminded me of some of the much basic fundamentals of organizing, which is we try to essentially make everybody think with their hearts and then their minds to make sure that they're able to conceptually understand the story and the nuance behind it, as opposed to just throwing numbers in terms of this is the amount of millions of dollars or billions of dollars, rather, that undocumented immigrants will provide to the economy if they're provided a pathway to legalization. Or this is the amount of families that will be separated. Instead, we try to focus on the self and on the individual and the community aspect of it and the impact that it will have in that, and try to broaden out those parameters to make sure that people understand. Because the unfortunate part as well in some of the immigration aspects that I've seen over the years is that for allies or people who may not be directly impacted, these tactics work and they dive into the issue because of a specific narrative, But once that narrative is resolved, say, for example, that, bright-eyed student that wanted to go to college, overcame the odds, graduated, eventually adjusted their status. Once that arc is resolved, that ally, instead of diving even further, kind of retracts because it's no longer personal for them. So it's our job to make sure that that person, as caring and active, because they were activated for a period of time, we want to make sure that that person continues to be and stand in solidarity, whoever they may be, because we know that they cared about the issue at one point, and we don't want them to ever stop. Just because that person was able to adjust their immigration status or move on into the next chapter of their lives, we want to make sure that they take a second and think about and reflect about that journey that they had and how it impacts their neighbors, their community, their district, their county, their state, and overarchingly realize that this, some of the issues that we're, that you and I may represent, is not just, located, whether it's in California or here in Washington, D.C., but a lot of them have a bunch of intersections on the national stage, and it's on us to make sure that we expose them and essentially talk about them sincerely in the best adequate way that we possibly can. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, so I have lots of opinions about this. I would love to hear about, how you, what you think is the best way to share a story. But I think, we really can't, those are missed opportunities for us, right? The person who comes in into the conversation, who comes into the issue. And I do believe in giving people multiple entry points, right? But the entry point can't be the end. The entry point has to be the beginning. And so how am I then turning that passion that they have for seeing, someone who is an undocumented immigrant go to college? How am I turning that into passion for a farm worker, right, who is working the fields during a pandemic to keep us all fed? How am I using that bit of empathy that they showed to create more empathy for in other places that they might not have cared about? And so I'm always thinking about what is the next step here. And I think that's individual for each campaign that you
Absolutely.
do. But it really is about thinking beyond that. You have to think beyond that entry point. What comes next for this person? How do we create an engagement ladder for everybody? And really understand what are the multiple points on the engagement ladder that they can come in on, and what do we do with them after that, right? So I'll go back to our sexual health campaign just really quickly. We created a 4-step engagement ladder that was one about kind of, okay, I'm just lurking around the issue and interested in it, to I am somebody who is engaged and ready to talk about this really this subject that can be really taboo for Black women, to I am someone who is ready to now, not only I'm ready to advocate for myself, and then I'm ready to advocate for others, right? And how did we get people to each one of those levels? And we also knew that people would enter the campaign at each one of those levels. We would have people who were already ready to advocate for others. So how did we use them to engage people who are further back down? Like, I think that sometimes the communications problem is that we do not effectively use all of the assets that we have that are coming in to the picture. And I know that part of that is a capacity issue. Is definitely a capacity issue, and not one that is, but also sometimes it's just a lack of, really being thoughtful about how are we using this resource. And when we do have a lack of capacity, what are the assets that we brought into the campaign who aren't being paid, right, but are just out there on the ground and can be mouthpieces that further the work and are engaged and ready to do so, because often we're just not using those folks. And I don't want to say using them, but we are not bringing in and mobilizing them to do really critical work that they would want to do and be invested in doing. But I do, but to go back to like, what is your way, you know, for sharing a story, and what kind of frameworks do you use?
Yeah, thank you. You know, I think what's important for me, you know, in storytelling at the beginning, just to kind of show again the evolution that I tried to showcase in some of the learnings, was in the beginning, it was all centered around, you know, academics. You know, for me, it was about telling myself and telling my story from the academic standpoint. You know, I came to school because my parents wanted to, I came to this country because my parents wanted to afford me a better opportunity, and I wanted to go to college. And because, you know, the broken immigration system, I can't go to college. What an injustice. And we, you know, within the quote unquote dreamer movement, you know, back in the days of 2008, 2009, 2010, when the DREAM Act was at its peak in terms of, you know, potentially passing through the US Congress and making it to President Obama's desk, you know, that was essentially the way that we grounded stories. But obviously the years went by, the DREAM Act never became law, and we realized that by just cycling or siloing through the education point, we left a lot of people behind. We left a lot of people behind who didn't want to go to college, or, you know, couldn't go to college, or education wasn't essentially the only way that they wanted to tell their stories, because the parameters were such that what we were doing was ignoring a lot of the things and commonalities that strengthened our movement, the challenges that people were seeing, you know, whether it was socioeconomic status or discrimination, or the challenges about some of the things that people were facing when it came down to fighting unjust rules or policies that were clamping down at the very hyper local level, which is what mattered to them most in terms of, you know, and I remember this vividly at the training site, you're talking about something that's happening in Washington, D.C. in Congress. Meanwhile, the evictions that are happening in our community are targeting immigrants, Black and brown people disproportionately. And, you know, I can't go to Washington, D.C. if I don't have a home. And I remember that so vividly because in my head, you know, up until that point in my journey, I had never left Florida. I had always lived in Florida with my parents, and it kind of brought me, as I continue to expand my viewpoint of the issue and also of this country, that those were very real challenges that needed also to be addressed almost simultaneously for this to essentially be a collective that was kind of at a level playing field so that we could be even more effective. So I guess that to kind of ramp it up in there, I've changed obviously over the years in terms of perspective, in terms of the way that I speak about the issue and the way that I consider the issue to be as personal as it is to me currently, while acknowledging that my story is just one of many, and I mean many of them. And now it's important to me, for me to essentially tell the entirety of the story in as many, and as not just focused around, you know, just one specific theme, but rather tell people, you know, a lot of the things that you may read about me or that you've seen about me up until this point is always centered about this person was published and, you know, this person was spearheading, and those are all true. Those things did happen, but behind those things and behind those, you know, the introductions and behind a lot of the things that you may see in the media is always about when I went to college, you know, I didn't have a job, and I had to rely on all the savings that I had while essentially trying to figure out how to hustle and make it through those nights where I didn't know when the next meal was going to come, and essentially, you know, figure out a way to work with my parents who also didn't have, you know, a substantial, you know, amount of money to fend off to me. And essentially experience a lot of that truth that sometimes gets obscured because it doesn't make it into my own personal narrative as, you know, as a way to communicate that challenge and that struggle. And I'm not saying that I do that to try to seek sympathy and empathy, but rather it's the reality of the moment that I lived in, that is not just unique to me, but rather to millions of people who go to college and are unclear about where they're going to get their next meal from, experience all kinds of insecurities about housing, about food, and about, after they leave college, about how they're going to repay their student loans. And I try to take all those things with me to make sure that when I tell my story, yes, it's definitely an immigration story, but it's an immigration story that has challenges and is connected to a much broader set of issues that impact every single day people in this country. I don't care whether you are born US citizen, or you're a legal permanent resident, or you're undocumented like me. You are facing some kind of challenge that grounds us all into the realities that we're all experiencing as a community and as a country. And I guess to just kind of put the lid on it, moving forward, no pun intended, given my employer's name, moving forward, what I try to center us around the most is essentially giving these skills to the next generation. Obviously, we live in a moment in time where it's a little bit challenging to meet or hold trainings in person, but I'm taking every opportunity to make sure that the skills and the storytelling techniques and the realities that I have accumulated through the years gets passed on, to a lot of the interns that we have on staff right now, to a lot of the people that I communicate or reach out to me, and without pushing them to become advocates, because that's not always everybody's cup of tea, as challenging as it may be. I always try to give people some lessons that they can take away with them, because it's important for me to at least show them this is only a section of your life. It will not define you. We need to work on it. And while you're carrying this with you, we need to look at other avenues in which we can also make sure that your story sounds, because this is not going to be the only telling of this specific struggle. And we need to be as mindful, as inclusive, and and we need to make sure that we break down the barriers that sometimes keep us down when it comes down to the higher narratives that get told about our communities and our people through the media and other mediums as well. I'm trying to keep an eye out here because I wasn't sure if I saw some of the tech folks in the background. I also see that we have some comments in here as well, but also we're running out of time. We have 2 minutes left here. I think time just flew by.
Yes.
Any last words before I give it into a rapid round of questions here from the chat?
Yes, quickly. Opportunity is what I hear through all of this, is the through line. And we really need to reframe how we think about opportunity. Opportunity has always been defined by what the richest white men in this country have. And I don't think of that as success or opportunity anymore. I think of being able to live a good life that is free and liberate, where I am free. I feel free when I move about in the world, is what is most important to me. Moving through the world with empathy for other folks is what is important to me. And that comes from a shifting of how I think about what opportunity looks like. And that means that you don't have to be a rich, white, college educated man to be successful. You can be a farm worker, right, who is feeding people. You can be a grocery store worker who goes to work every day, who makes a living wage, and have a good life. And that is what opportunity and success should look like in our country. It's everybody getting to lead the life that they want to live. It does not have to be being or having what rich white men in this country have always had.
Absolutely. And I think just to get, wrap it up in there, I think we're running out of time, but you also don't have to be the star-studded dreamer out there. There's dignity in the work that a lot of the immigrant community does, all segments of it. And we want to make sure that, we continue to lift their voices, their stories, and their struggles, not just in the days and weeks to come. We have a new president, we have a new administration. That doesn't mean that the work ends. There's a lot of work ahead of us. There's a lot of misconceptions and false narratives about who we are. And there's a lot of people out there that are still employing, unfortunately, the same tactics about just taking that soundbite and trying to essentially capitalize on a very small segment of a story to try to make it seem like we're just reduced to that one aspect of our lives. So I'm happy to have been invited and to have had the opportunity to sit on this panel with you, Kacey, despite the numerous tech challenges that we saw. It's still early on the West Coast, so I hope that you're having a cup of tea or a cup of coffee for the rest of your morning. For those of you on the East Coast, like myself, it's noon. I'm actually gonna run out and get some brunch safely, social distance. This actually been delivered to my lobby. You know, thank you for the opportunity, and thank you, Kacey, for you know, allowing us to learn from everything that you're doing on your side of the country and with your community. It's been a pleasure. To everybody who's tuned in, thank you for bearing with us on a Saturday, and thank you for joining Catalyst. We'll see you next time.
Thank you, Juan.